Okay, just have to put it in present mode and you'll be good to go.
Okay. Can everybody see?
Wow, nice choice of background. I just want to shout out to Jill who set us up and make us look so great together. And you chose the clouds. I love it.
Chose it. Why not? um, so wonderful to meet everybody. I'm going to give my perspective from the COVID ICU. I am a stroke neurologist, a neuro ICU doctor, and a neurointerventional surgery fellow. And I spent several months from late March to June during the first wave of COVID-19 in the COVID ICU in the New Jersey area. And as you know, New Jersey and New York were the hardest hit. And this was before the quote unquote evidence or COVID-19 evidence. This was when we kind of had to buckle up and think for ourselves. So first, a little about what I do. So neurointerventional surgery is pretty much brain plumbing. It's very practical. It is something I very much enjoy because you get to see somebody go from being paralyzed on the right side and unable to speak to potentially being able to speak and walk again and asked to go home the next day. That is a rare occurrence, but when it happens, it's wonderful. And this is a picture of a thrombectomy where we go up through with the catheters and wires. And if you see here, there's a blockage here. That's your main artery in your brain that supplies your language center, your ability to speak and communicate and engage and, be present. And then after, this is the after picture where this clot has removed and now the brain has all this blood flow. This is, and this requires a lot of collaboration. It's a whole team effort. Definitely a lot of dedication because we do these things at 3 a.m. sometimes, and everybody needs to be ready to go like a well-oiled machine, from the neurointerventional surgeon to the techs, the nurses, the residents, everybody working together. And then this is another one. This is a basilar artery aneurysm, which is like really, really, really serious, where the brainstem is. So, and somebody who has a bleed like this, they can die. So here we coiled it and now it's gone. So this requires a little courage too, because it's kind of very risky procedure. So these things, kind of as a group prepared us, I think, for the collaboration and the compassion and the dedication that was required, and the courage that was required to really throw ourselves into something that was not completely familiar to us and not familiar for anybody really. So that's me in the COVID ICU here, smiling with a thumbs up, even though obviously, a lot of bad things were happening at the time, but, we made the best out of a very unknown situation. So at this time, it was late March, and our hospital had about 300 or so COVID-19 patients, almost 100 of them on the ventilator, critically ill. And when we jumped in, we volunteered as a group because we had, it's a group of neuro-intensivists, like neuro ICU doctors, neurosurgeons, neurointerventional surgeons, because we had the experience of working in the ICU, even if that was for the brain. We had enough familiarity with, pulmonary or lung critical care and working the ventilator to be able to step up and help the medical or pulmonary lung ICU doctors who were very much overwhelmed. So we went into it and we saw at first so much death. There was the turnover of patients would be every day. The first day we went in, we had about 20 or so patients in our little COVID ICU, which was our old neuro ICU. And within that day, before we could even get our bearings and figure out what was going on with different patients, half of those people passed away. And that was the way that things were going. It was just like a sort of vicious cycle where people would pass away, and then people who were stable on the floor would become unstable and then have to be upgraded to the COVID ICU. So it was very challenging because as we were very much had the unique opportunity to make a difference usually, and have a very set protocol, guideline driven way of doing things. And this was something just completely foreign that nobody knew what to do. no, it was the great equalizer. The infectious disease doctors, the lung doctors, the neuro doctors, everybody was just on the same level, and having to think for ourselves, in the absence of evidence, but evidence of urgency, so to speak, where, we had to use knowledge that we had acquired, like probably from medical school, like the basic foundations where you learn about all the different organ systems, all the different interactions of the organ systems, and sort of the basic science of things and how things work on a very microscopic level. And we all had to go back to that, where we all sort of were at a level playing field, and we had to use creativity to take a concept from maybe a pandemic or a similar viral disease from decades ago, try to understand that and try to apply those things to COVID. And that's what we did. So in the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of different treatments being thrown around, from tocilizumab, remdesivir, plasma, steroids, all these different things. But we found that throwing everything in the kitchen sink without really thinking it through was not really helping the patients, and it was getting sort of convoluted and difficult to really measure what was making a difference and what wasn't. So so we thought systematically, just like in the regular ICU, took a step back, deep breath, systematic. So we thought, okay, what happens to these people? What is COVID-19? What is COVID-19? What does it do? A lot of people have SARS-CoV-2, but they don't develop the disease. So we started thinking of it as more of a systemic whole body process, where the body has too much inflammation, goes into that cytokine storm that's talked about on the news, and also has very, very low levels of oxygen. And that's the basic fundamental thing. That manifests a lot of times as a lung problem, because that's the red herring, is obviously the lungs would be most obviously affected by low oxygen levels and things of that sort. But we noticed that the thicker blood, the blood that has a lot of inflammation, leads to lung disease, leads to heart disease, leads to kidney failure, leads to gut disease, leads to skin problems, leads to strokes, leads to everything. And having an understanding of that and being able to target that in different body systems really helped us to make a difference. And there was one day, which I'll discuss in a little bit, that really inspired me to really, like one of the most positive days I won't ever forget in this whole pandemic in my life, that really resonated with us. And after we really put through this sort of protocol that we devised to treat people, and had many of them actually do well. And on this other side is just like a CBSN segment that I did on like the whole vaccination thing, and how, all the confusion on vaccination, and, can people stop quarantining and double masking, and all these different, sort of misinformation that is I think the big headliner of COVID-19 is misinformation. And what I mentioned in that talk was actually wrong, but I acknowledged that it was wrong, because I said that, at the time the variants were just they were sort of weary of the variants. And I was like, well, it's unclear if the vaccines will work for the variants, but it may, because really at the end of the day, we're, as a group of smart people getting together and thinking things through, we have to be open to the fact that usually people are wrong, and usually things are wrong, and a lot of things are dynamic, and saying something is yes or no does not make sense, because what is the saying? The more you know, the more you realize you don't know anything. So that was sort of that I got from that. So I put hashtag melatonin. So this was one of the reasons that I thought there needs to be like some sort of like information segue for COVID-19. So it was like 3 a.m. in the COVID ICU, and because we had 24-hour coverage. There was each of us were there for a shift to cover 24/7 always. And there were 2 nurses there who were peers, very good friends. And they were just talking to me saying, Farah, just FYI, why are we giving melatonin to these patients? These patients are like, they're intubated, they're sedated, they are not waking up. Why would we give something for sleep to a person in this condition? And the nurse, she said that she had asked one of the doctors earlier that day, and that he had said something along the lines, not verbatim, but because we just do it. And she got a little frustrated with that and thought that it might have been an error, and just withheld that because it is a vitamin, it's a supplement. So to do no harm, always do no harm, but not do something that's maybe unnecessary without knowing why you're doing it. Because these nurses are good nurses and they want everything they do for their patient to actually make sense, or at least like talk to the physician and collaborate together to do something that makes sense. So I went on this whole like talk because I love melatonin for other weird neuroplasticity reasons. But I told her that, oh, we're not using it for sleep. Melatonin is beneficial because of the anti-inflammatory properties, the anti-infective properties, the antioxidant properties, and all of these different things that actually work in conjunction with everything else in these critically ill patients. And that's why we're doing it. So, she was like, they were like, oh, well, this makes sense. Thanks. And then we'll continue to do it. But I thought, as the people in the COVID ICU at the time, all the doctors and nurses and staff who were very knowledgeable and there at the front line still have some misunderstanding of what we're doing. So, and at the time, I really didn't have much of an understanding either. I had to learn because we were also doing a clinical trial in our neuroscience center, because we're very much like busy. I just like to stay busy with the surgeries and with research, but all of our clinical trials were on hold when COVID happened. So, we were like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And at the time, we devised a clinical trial where it was really to help on this. It was twofold, partially to help frontline workers and try to find a sort of prophylactic agent that pre-exposure healthcare workers could get. And on the side, I also had to do, because I am the study director of the study, I had to do a lot of research and do a lot of reading that I may have not otherwise done. So combining that knowledge of on the front lines, what do we do, what works, what's practical, not unrealistic, and also having to do my research on the other, SARS virus and on MERS and the other forms of coronavirus, and having to do all that background sort of was like, okay, I felt, at least at a point where I could be like, I'm going to set up something where, I can get information out to the world. So then this is me in the COVID ICU looking very dorky, but whatever, it was 3 a.m. or something like that. So me and the nurses and we decided to do this, it was COVID-19 crash course. And I just did it on my Instagram TV. And I planned, we went through an A through Z list. Like just because I made it easier, A being ACE and antibodies from Z to zinc and everything in between, like 27 topics. I did maybe like 7 of them. And then I got very busy and I didn't, I didn't finish, as that can happen. We're very ambitious and sometimes we're like, oh, there's other things going on. But over time, what I was doing is every time I would prepare for one of these little talks on my Instagram TV, where I was drawing little pictures and I would write things up on like a Microsoft Word, just so I could remember thoughts that I wanted to make sure I said. And after like the 3rd or 4th time, I realized I was writing pages and pages of information, and it was starting to add up to something. So then I decided I'm going to take this information and I'm going to turn it into a book. And that was the deciding factor. Now, the motivation to write a book, because I've never written one, and I mean, we do a lot of like academic writing, like for research, but not like I've never written a book. So I didn't know what to do. So there was another event that happened that really, really did inspire me. So this was the little Instagram TV, like maybe like 1,000 or so views. I was like, oh, this isn't bad. At least somebody's listening out there. All right. So, and this is just something, an excerpt from the book where the book is very simple, black and white, to the point, no fancy graphics, so just the meat of the information. So I just have I made it up, but it makes sense. The level of evidence on the right side up pyramid, and then degree of quality on the other side. And if you look on the bottom, we have the animal and lab studies, which is where a lot of research starts. And that really is more of looks at the mechanism of action of things, how things work. And then we have case reports and case series, which are like a bunch of rare events, and it's sort of at the border with expert opinion, where we have like rare diseases, rare cases, and we explain them and we do literature reviews, and then we try to make some loose associations, but that's not meaningful until there's a lot of them together. And then we have expert opinion, editorials, and reviews, which is where a lot of what the public sees and listens to stands. The expert opinion of somebody who has been doing something for 40 years states. And then editorials and reviews that people that may get transitioned from some academic journal to like the New York Times or to another outlet where it's sort of explained. Where there can be, as you can imagine, a lot of bias in that, but sometimes it is very helpful, especially in well-established theories or things that we have a solid understanding of. In COVID-19, it's kind of hard to do that. And then cohort and case control studies, that's where a lot of studies lie, sort of lighting nature tickets cohort studies, where there's an intervention and you observe how people do over time, kind of in their natural environment. And then there's the sort of the higher tier studies, which at the time COVID-19 didn't have yet. There were a lot of studies sort of ongoing. And as you guys know, there were some that were even retracted, which is a rare occurrence to happen in like New England Journal or Lancet. Like for an article to get retracted, that speaks volumes in that kind of regard. So randomized control trials are like the creme de la creme, they're high quality, they are controlled. And then we have meta-analyses and systemic reviews, which I don't think COVID-19 is there yet. There's a lot of randomized control trials now. There's maybe some early systemic reviews, which is like a critical appraisal of all the randomized control trials and maybe some others. So that's even like higher tier. And then after that, you have the clinical guidelines, which is like the stroke guidelines, the heart guidelines, the guidelines that guide the whole 360 picture of a specialty. And I think COVID-19 is far from that, although the CDC has guidelines, the WHO has the World Health Organization has guidelines, everybody has guidelines, but to really have ones that are solid and obviously changeable, because that's how knowledge works, is a long way coming, but perhaps in the future. So this is my book, Pandemic Manifesto. And I just like wrote it, I would write it at like 3 a.m. when I was in the COVID ICU writing, or in my quarantine hotel just writing. And then, just put it together. And then I designed a little cover on the Kindle. I as you can tell, I'm not very technologically savvy. I'm like 20 years older in technology wizardry, but whatever, it turned out okay. So this Extubation Day. So this was a day that was one of the most meaningful days of my life. So, and for all of us, I think, who were there. So when we started out the COVID ICU, like late March, people were doing, it was like the climate was so grim. The morale of people who were typically very optimistic was just understandably like very much at its end. So using that protocol that we devised, system-based, practical, pragmatic, how the brain works, how the heart works, how the lungs work, how the kidneys work, and trying to support the body to heal itself instead of, and obviously for when appropriate, giving, remdesivir, giving tocilizumab, giving plasma when appropriate. But we wanted everybody, all these patients to be equal, not because one person qualifies for this, one person qualifies for that. We wanted everybody to have a standard of care. So that's what we did. And then there was the Monday, this is a Friday. So that Monday of that April 17th, we had a plan. My shift at that time, I was working overnight later on, but at that time I was the 6 a.m. person who would come at 6 a.m., see all the COVID patients, and then, change their ventilator settings to they need to be prone and different things like that. And then there's a midday person, night person, etc. So that day, my mentor who I was working with, we decided, you know what? And nobody at this time had gotten extubated, or nobody had gotten the breathing tube out of their, nobody had survived or gotten extubated who had gotten that sick. So this was actually would have been the first time. So that Monday we looked at our different patients and we made a game plan. We thought about 7 of them looked like it was possible. Their renal failure was getting better. Their lungs were getting better. Their blood clots were able to be treated. Like, we were like, okay, there's a light at the end of the tunnel for these people, and we're not gonna tell anybody else. We're just gonna do it in our group, and then because we wanted it to be a surprise on Friday for the other nurses and doctors to be surprised. So we worked all week, like sort of like strategically, like getting these people teed up and all that. And then Friday, I went in and I was like super nervous. I went around. 5 of the people looked good enough. 2 of them, I was like, it's a stretch. I'm not going to push this, because if this works, that means we'll be able to do this for other people safely later on. So there were 5 people And I remember all of their rooms. I remember all of their faces. I remember everything that day. So they were all men because there is a predilection for males to have a more severe course of COVID-19 for various reasons, young and middle-aged, sometimes older, but not so much, usually younger and middle-aged, late middle-aged. So one was a young guy who had some kidney problems, but was otherwise okay. The other guy was a guy who was an old guy, and he was very sick, and we were rooting for him, and we needed to just give him the chance, because if it was now or never for this guy. And then there was another middle-aged guy on the other side who his lungs were terrible, but the whole time he was in the ICU, he would give a thumbs up. He was super with it. The most optimistic guy, intubated, going like this every day. And then there were two guys in the back. One guy who was a young police officer who was so scared. He was very young, I think late 30s. He was very so scared that he got married on the iPad before he got intubated because he thought he was going to die, and he wanted to get married before that happened. So he did that via FaceTime or something. And then there was another guy on the other side of him, an old, like middle-aged guy, super nice, always looked good clinically, like he was awake, but all of his numbers looked terrible. Like, but he looked so good, and we were like, we also need to just give this guy a chance. So then we made our rounds, went to the first guy, the young guy with the kidney problems. We extubated him, and it was like everybody and it was like we all stood around him like, oh my God. And the first thing he did was half smile like this. He smiled, so we knew he was okay. He smiled. And then everybody just stopped and looked like in the negative pressure room, like, what just happened? Like, what's going on? And we left, and we're like, we extubated him. They're like, no way. You mean he died? I'm like, no, we extubated him. Like, because that's usually what that meant. Extubation means like you're passed away. No, he's fine. He's okay. And then some of the nurses, they were obviously very burnt out because they're the ones who are going in the rooms like every hour and seeing the patients, and they feel like so much of what they're doing is futile. That the next guy, the nurse was like, I don't know if he's ready, almost apprehensive, because I think she was so worried. Like, to have that much hope is scary sometimes, to have that much hope. So he was the guy always giving the thumbs up, and he was really sleepy that day. We told him, you need to wake up. We're going to extubate you. And to incentivize him, we actually put his daughter on the phone and FaceTimed her, and she was encouraging him. And then he woke up. He got extubated. And then the third guy, the two guys in the back, extubated. The guy who didn't look too good, we did it. We extubated him. And then afterward, we called the families, which was, because at that time, all like the people, the general population was at home, quarantining, like really staying at home. Not like now where things are sort of an in-between. Like, it was strict lockdown. Everything is closed. They're home. And they're hearing of all these things on the news, seeing this and wondering, why am I quarantining myself? Why am I here? It's hard to visualize what we see, and it's hard to understand what we see when you're not there. But for these people, they knew because their loved one is in the ICU. So they understand that whatever it is, it's bad. And then we called them, and each family member, I've never heard tears of joy like that before. And I bawled like a baby because I often do, and it is what it is. It was well worth it. And then later on that day, we extubated the 5 people. It was the first time anybody had been extubated. So we did it 5 just to make more of a like, poof, like this is possible. And all these people were very different. We went to our neuroscience center because we were like in the middle of the clinical trial, and we were doing like testing and swabbing and blood, like drawing blood and doing all this stuff. And then we went back like sort of to check out and see what's going on. And then we realized that it had like spread like wildfire, because that's how everything spreads. But this was actually good news that spread, not like bad news. So everybody was like, did you hear about the 5 people that got extubated? Oh my God. And I could feel like a certain glimmer of hope come back, really come back from the doctors who were like burnt out, to the environmental services lady who was so happy because she's the one going in there and risking her life and taking sharps containers away. Like, everybody was so happy, and I was ecstatic. So then later on, I hadn't eaten all day. I think I had something terrible, but it tasted really good. And then I like sort of, we couldn't hug at the time. We didn't even do like the COVID hug with the elbow. It was like the time where you didn't know what to do. You just kind of went, hi, this is great. And they were crying, and it was amazing. And then later on, we were all staying at a COVID, a hotel, isolated from our families, obviously, because we were like a petri dish, you know. So we went back, and I remember like that night was the night that I that night, and because it's all a blur at this point, but I was like, I'm gonna write a book. And then I did one of the I was going to do one of the Instagram TV sessions, but then I just passed out. So, and before passing out, I texted the night the night ICU doctor, hey, did anybody get reintubated? Because I wanted to go to bed with like a clear head. Nobody did, and everybody was okay. And these guys, one of the guys did end up passing away, the one who looked really like we expected it, but we wanted to just do it for him. The other 4 walked out of the hospital and like are completely fine. And then one of them sent us a video of him at home, like fine. And then that inspired us. And then we continued to extubate people regularly after that. Like every week we would extubate. I mean, our survival rates were higher than would be expected. And we put our numbers together, and that's another project we're working on, just to see like it was like statistically significant difference, and obviously clinically significant difference, as far as people who got off the ventilator and survived and went home after being that sick. So, because once you get on the ventilator, the earlier studies said, you know, the chances of dying are like 90%. So don't get on the ventilator. But ours were, I don't know right now, maybe like 30 or so. So we were able to get people through, and it was amazing, and it was wonderful. So that inspired me to just do more, keep going. All right. So I just have like little excerpts from the book that would help me to kind of discuss, like, I don't know, COVID in general. But this is just like from the intro where I talked about I called it the silver lining, where, you know, the day that we went and extubated those people. So it was 0600 hours on a Friday in the old neuro ICU as I walked into a modern day war zone, the COVID-19 ICU. Of the 300 plus COVID-19 patients occupying our 499 bed hospital, nearly 100 were on the ventilator. And then on a day like any other, at the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, in an epicenter microcosm plagued by the same hurdles and hardships as anywhere else, a rare feat was accomplished. 25% of patients in the old neuro ICU were extubated in one day. And then I went on from there. So know the enemy. So that's one of the chapters where I just discuss like what a virus is, what bacteria are, because I think a lot of times it's unfamiliar to people. So so know the enemy. Well, bacteria and other microbes, which include like a bunch of different kinds of archaea and protists and amoebas and all these different things that live in our bodies. While bacteria and other microbes are quarantined to their own quarters in the human body, viruses infiltrate human cells because they are unable to live outside of their host. After a virus invades, if it does not conquer, it hides in plain sight and lies in wait until its host is vulnerable. At that time, it colludes with its viral brethren and takes formation into a Trojan horse, attacking from the inside out. And that's really how it works. So viruses, as you know, become a part of you. They become a part of your body. That's why they become reactivated when your immune system's weak, etc. Bacteria you can clear. They are, I mean, most of the time. But viruses, it's important to realize that. And they're so small. They're like tens of hundreds of thousands of times smaller than a bacteria. So you can imagine this tiny little enemy that can cause so much damage. It's remarkable to think of that, but it's the power of numbers, where there's trillions of them in one of us, and all of the downstream effects of a virus. It's not just the virus itself, it's all of the downstream effects, even after you clear a virus, that cause the sequelae and all of those long-standing symptoms, as you know, from the COVID long haulers, etc. Oh, and yeah, this is a little diagram from the book as well. I just thought it was helpful to put it in perspective. So in the human body, we have 1 trillion cells. We're one species, of course. We have 20,000 genes. And the cells we have are 100,000 times smaller than us. So each of our cells is 1/100th of thousands of us. And then we have 100 plus trillion microbes in our body, thousands of species, over 2 million genes, and they are 1 million times smaller than us. And then viruses, I said quadrillion because nobody really knows how much viral load we have. Because viruses, as they rely on numbers, your body can have one type of virus, but there can be trillions or trillions of copies of that virus. And most of us have multiple viruses in our body from birth to death. And viruses have at least 2,000 species, at least 2+ million genes. It's much less explored than the microbiome, which is like the microbiome and Human Genome Project are very well established, whereas the Viral Genome Project is sort of an ongoing thing that's very dynamic. And they are 10 million times smaller than us. They're actually much more similar to the size of our own DNA and RNA. And that's why viruses are classified by whether they're DNA viruses or RNA viruses, because they're actually pretty much just a little capsule encapsulating some DNA genetic material. That's how small they are. And that's why they're defined that way. And they're not that, when you compare the size of a virus to an atom, it's like comparing our body to our cells. So that's how small they are. Now, this is another chapter about flattening the curve, which is like the coat of arms of like COVID-19. So this is just a little excerpt from the book. And this is just cute. I thought it's like matches and then a little house, stay home, don't catch on fire. And then you prevent the spread of it, you know? So flattening the curve is neither a novel concept nor a novice pursuit. Epidemic curves derived from series of data points in continuum have been used to visualize outbreaks for centuries, from cholera in London 1854 to yellow fever in Angola 2016, and of course to COVID-19 in world 2019 to present. COVID-19 is a mixed source outbreak turned pandemic. It is mainly a hybrid of point source, continuous common source, and progressive source outbreaks that has taken on different forms at different points in time and space. So this is, and then I just went through, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I feel like sometimes one of my, some wise man I know, well, he's wise way beyond his years, said something really meaningful, that sometimes the people who can best explain something are people who are a little bit out of that specialty or a little bit out of that expertise and can explain it in like a meaningful way that's understandable to the masses. So I'm not an epidemiologist, but I learned epidemiology when I was in medical school. So I sort of tried to extrapolate that to help understand, you know, why COVID-19 is affecting different places at different rates at different times. And I just made a series of graphs that I put into the book. So this is the outbreak of an existing infection, something that is already out there. You already have a baseline prevalence and incidence, prevalence being the total amount of people who have it and incidence being the people who get it. And then you might have an outbreak for whatever reason. And then it peaks and then it declines because it already has its own sort of place in nature, and nature takes its course and has made things to sort of control it, mitigate it, done. Only until it peaks again. And then this is a point source outbreak. So point source outbreaks are kind of like E. coli outbreak at a fast food place or Chipotle or something like that, where there's a point source, there's an infectious source, and then there's exposure and transmission. There's a short incubation period, whatever that pathogen is, and then after that, either people recover or they pass away, and then that's it. It's one time. COVID is not that. Maybe at the original source. I know that there's controversy around that, but whatever that was, for those few people who were initially infected, it was maybe a point source outbreak for them, but then it sort of propagated into something much more. Now, so COVID-19 is maybe a little bit more like this, the continuous common source outbreak. So there's a point source, wherever that may be, and there's exposure, transmission, and that obviously, the way that the curve ends up going depends on all the mitigation strategies that are in place or lack thereof. So, and there's multiple incubation periods that occur because there's an initial infection, and then there's recovery and death, but then there's ongoing sources of infection because people go in the community and spread the virus or for whatever reason. So there's continuous infection. You can't control when it's so widespread and it's everywhere. It's so hard to control. Hard to control from the top, hard to control from the bottom, hard to control anywhere. Unless everyone is on the same page, which I don't think ever happened in human history. And then this sort of goes on and on until eventually it dies down, if it does die down. And then there's propagated source outbreaks. So this is interesting. So usually there's a single case, and then there's an incubation period, and then there's and then it has like a short incubation period, and then it goes into a second wave, a third wave. And then as you can see here, there's mitigated and unmitigated. Unmitigated meaning the peak is higher and it's more dramatic because of, lack of sort of infrastructure, which was very apparent in the beginning of this pandemic. And also with regards to unmitigated waves, it's reasonable and maybe it's maybe practical to think like mitigation strategies. You may end up having the same amount of people have the disease, but the peak won't be as high. And the peak is where there's all that demand. And when the demand is high, that's when there's a problem. That's when there's lack of resources. That's when there's no N95s. That's when there's a lack of ventilators. So just having a slow and steady pace, even if the area under the curve is the same, is better. So in and of itself, that's something. And then here we have intermittent source outbreaks. So this is actually, it's actually kind of sad, but intermittent source outbreaks usually occur in like niche settings, like in animals and in tribal communities, but it actually happens in COVID-19. That's when people are staying inside. The ones who go outside, they go outside. The ones who stay in, they stay in. Everybody has their routine. Everybody does something different. Grandma stays inside. The kids go out to play or to do whatever. But then there's the Memorial Day, there's the Christmas, there's Thanksgiving, where there's a peak because people come out of wherever they've come out of, and the people who are already out are out anyway, and then there's a peak. So COVID-19 in a lot of ways, especially in places where there's not a lot of cases, because when there's a lot of cases, it'll be a common continuous source. But when there's not a lot of cases, you'll see these. This is more like apparent, like, oh, all of a sudden there's 50 cases coming in the hall. Well, what was it a week ago? What holiday was it? What weekend was it? Yeah. So I just, put this here for COVID-19 because it's not the most straightforward. There's sort of a blur as to how this is going to end up. And that is a, I guess that's probably like a 10-day conference talk about where things are going to go. We really have hypotheses, but no substantive theory. So I put this here. This is not like evidence-based, or this is not like from a paper. I put it there just so that it's not somebody freaks out. But it's something I thought was useful for like the anti-maskers or people who don't like to wear masks or whatever. So it's not completely accurate, but it makes some sense, and I thought it was a good visual. So you think you have an asymptomatic carrier here, somebody who tests positive for SARS-CoV-2 but does not have symptoms. And then here you have the healthy contact. So without a mask, you're probably going to transmit things to people. Without a mask, the asymptomatic carrier, who should probably be at home, who should obviously be quarantining, and the healthy contact has a mask, there's still a chance of transmission. With the asymptomatic carrier wearing a mask and the healthy contact not wearing a mask, which is what a lot of people want. They're like, I'm healthy, shouldn't have to do this. The people who are high risk, who may be asymptomatic carriers, should wear a mask. I shouldn't, because I'm healthy and I want my freedom to do whatever I want. There's a 5%, there's a small risk. Just say small. Let's not put a fine number on it, but small. And with the mask, obviously, there's barely, there's barely any risk. But the whole point of this is the quote unquote healthy contact. There is no such thing. And that is why it's important, regardless of whether or not you test negative for COVID-19 and you despise wearing a mask. I have to wear like 2 or 3 of them at a time. It's terrible. N95 over mask, face shield, like, wearing the little surgical mask is like not even a thing. I don't care anymore, because it's all relative, right? It's all relative. If people were wearing fumigators, they would wish they could wear a mask. So here, there's no such thing as a healthy contact, because you never know what kind of vulnerabilities you have that make you more susceptible. Whether that's, the big topics is like if you're you have type A blood type, you're a male, you have this amount of testosterone, all these different things. You just don't know, because I have seen, and unfortunately so, a lot of actually very, very frequently, young men getting intubated and dying of COVID-19. Whereas their grandma, who lives in the same household, got a little sick for a week and got over it. So you never know. This is not the same thing as, oh, I'm not immunocompromised, I don't have XYZ. This is when something is unknown, you can't assume a lot of things. You have to just err on the side of common sense and caution, because it is unknown. So I've seen way too many young people, even people who are healthy, that come to the clinic for an aneurysm or something that needs to be treated, they'll say, well, I'm 20 years old, I'm 30 years old, I got super sick. My parents had it, and they didn't have symptoms. So where is that? Where's that disconnect? Like there's some disconnect there. So I feel like if people, don't have that mentality that they're invincible, then they're more likely to understand the rationale for these things. And there is one. So next, so this is just like a little chart that goes over antibodies, because I think that this is something also pretty helpful, because there's a lot of talk of immunoglobulins and antibodies and all these different things. And COVID-19 has made like the average educated citizen who's out of medicine get like a crash course in medicine. And now they're using all these terms and using all these things, but I feel like it has to be in context. So it's really empowered people. I think it really has to really learn from them, learn for themselves. But there has to be a limit on like Dr. Google and all that. So here we have IgM and IgG. Those are the main players. And IgA is also really, really important and often like sort of overlooked. So IgM, that's like the early the early antibiotic that comes on early on in the process to help on the front lines. So it fights pathogens early before enough IgG is produced. IgG is the one that lasts long and is really powerful, but it takes time to build. So as IgG is building and building and building, IgM is right there ready to attack. And that's usually measured in the SARS-CoV-2 antibody tests. IgG is the major player in immunity in general, and it takes weeks to build up. It provides long-term immunity, and then it crosses the placenta also to give immunity to the fetus. Obviously there's variability, but more or less, not for COVID-19 in general, but in general, not for COVID-19. And this is usually the main antibody measured in the SARS-CoV-2 testing. And then there's IgA. So IgA is very, very interesting. So IgA is an antibody that we have in our mucus, our guts, our respiratory tracts, all the sticky parts of our bodies, genitals, saliva, tears, breast milk. And it's interesting because people there's genetic deficiencies of IgA deficiencies. These are the people who live in a bubble who can't fight off anything. They go to the hospital for the common cold. They have a deficiency in IgA. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, as you know, in people. There's polymorphisms, poly meaning many, morphs of things. So most people have varying degrees of IgA, like enough to keep them relatively healthy. But there's a reason that some people can, drink a gallon of rotten milk and they're fine, and somebody else has colds and gets sick for everything. Because IgA is not only in your mucus tract, so people that are easily susceptible to getting upper respiratory tract infections, others are not. And then also people that have sensitive guts, they have varying levels of IgA. So, unfortunately, IgA is not really measured in common antibody tests, but it's reasonable to think that a lot of people who just test positive and don't have symptoms because they have a lot of IgA, that their mucus barrier is strong and that is able to prevent transmission of the virus. Because inoculation and having a few little viral, particles in your nose, okay, but it's the dissemination and transmission to your body that causes the real problem. And then IgE and IgD are not relevant to COVID-19, but IgE is the one that is responsible for a lot of allergies and allergic responses, and when you have parasitic worms. So a lot of people with hypersensitivity and extra histamine, allergic to everything, and they have high IgE levels. And IgD we don't need to go there. So, and then with regards to testing, so there's a lot of talk about the sensitivity and specificity of tests. Early on, some of our testing was not very sensitive. So, so we'd have to actually test people 2 or 3 times in order to increase our yield. Like out of 3 tests, one of them is positive, okay, because sometimes, especially because it's dependent on who's doing it, they had varying levels of sensitivity. So just for common knowledge, for whatever it is, for whatever you choose to, whatever a person chooses to do in the future, surgical wise or medication wise or infection wise, it's good to know what sensitivity and specificity are. So sensitivity is what is the proportion of people with an infection or disease who actually who are accurately identified as having the infection. So it's the true positive rate. Specificity is the true negative rate. What proportion of people without an infection actually identified as not having it? So that's true negative rate. So sometimes screening tests, just general tests, are very sensitive because you don't want to miss anything. And then specific tests, sometimes the confirmatory test for HIV is very specific because you don't want people to think that they have something when they don't. And this is the different types of blood types. So there's pretty good evidence that type A blood type are more vulnerable to COVID-19. And there's a reason for that. That has a lot to do with the ACE, which is the angiotensin converting enzyme, and its interaction with spike and all of that stuff. But just to explain why. So type A blood types, they have an antigen, which is like a little protein on them. That's A, and they have anti-B, they're against B. And as you know, they're able to donate to A and B and able to accept from A and O. And then type B blood types, they have a B antigen. They have their self on them. They have theirs themselves, but they have anti-A. They have no A, they're B. And they're able to donate to others who have a B, whether that's B or AB. And then they can accept from B and O. And then there's AB, the universal acceptor, can get everything. They have A and B antigens. They have no antibodies because they can get everything. They're able to only donate to AB, but they can get everybody's blood. And then there's type O's. So there's evidence that type O have a less likelihood of getting SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. And that's actually, these studies about the A blood type and O blood type don't come, like obviously they're being tested in COVID-19, but they were actually, it's from the SARS, the initial SARS-CoV, not SARS-CoV-2. So the SARS virus, there's evidence of that. So it's similar in the coronaviruses in general. Like COVID-19 is not something like, it's new, but it has a history, sort of, at least, an evolution. So the O's don't have anything on them. They're very vulnerable. They can't get anything but other O blood, but they can give to everybody. And they have antibodies for everything. So this is like their only good thing, is that they're less likely to get COVID-19. All right. And then this is another sort of little excerpt from the, 10 minutes. Okay.
So, yeah, we're giving you the heads up that there's like 5 more minutes. So if you can, like,
I'll prioritize. No, I'll just prioritize. Okay.
Oh yeah. Thanks.
So this is from the book as well. This is the There Will Be Blood chapter. Just goes over the different kinds of viruses that cause bleeding or stroke. And I think it's meaningful for people to understand that, COVID-19 is not the only virus to affect blood clotting. Ebola causes hemorrhage, CMV, thrombosis, herpes zoster, HIV, EBV, which is like the mono disease, parvovirus, hepatitis, tons. So it's not, I mean, it's scary, but it's not the only one. There's so many more that can cause a similar picture. And I think we talked about ACE a little bit. Let me see. Oh, this is cool. So I am the storm. We just talked about the cytokine storm. That the cytokine storm is not a novel concept either. It represents the zenith of microscopic havoc on a microscopic pro-inflammatory pathogen can ravage on the human body. And cytokine storming can happen in not just in infection, but it can happen in people that have autoimmune disease and have like hyperinflammatory processes that affect them. And then the alchemy now, so I had gone into melatonin a little bit before that, but it also has amazing properties aside from, anti-aging and all that, that are anti-infection. And then here this is like all the biomarkers that we hear about that go up in COVID-19. The IL-6 is the one that we know of, the tocilizumab, the inhibitor of that, but there's many, many others that can be elevated in chronic infection, but are relevant to COVID-19. And then this is, I think, important. So the war propaganda, that was a little chapter on hydroxychloroquine. So hydroxychloroquine has been around for decades, and it's actually on the World Health Organization list of essential medications. And the whole thing about it causing issues is due to the prolonged QTC interval. But many medications can cause a prolonged QTC, the nausea meds, allergy meds, fungal meds, antibiotics, so many. And I think as with so many things in COVID-19, it was politicized and had maybe not the most unbiased, robust, tests, sort of studies done in regards to it. And then the drug arsenal part kind of goes into how these other drugs like remdesivir, tocilizumab, these are actually medications have been around for years, used for rheumatoid arthritis, used for juvenile arthritis, for chronic autoimmune diseases. They are not new. They're something that are being used for a new purpose. Just like the things that we make now for COVID-19 will be used for a new purpose in 20 years. And I just do the QT interval now. And then, this part I did want to go over. It was like a bit about vaccinations. So I had done this list before, early on. Like I did this in like early summer of last year, like June, July. So I just wanted to just put in perspective all the different kinds of vaccines. Since we don't have time, I'm just going to skip that and go into like the emerging types of vaccines. So none of these have been used in people before. DNA, RNA, and recombinant, aside from the Ebola virus. But these are the different virus vaccines that were in clinical trials at the time. And the RNA viruses, it's the first time an RNA virus is being used in a human, and that's the Moderna and the Pfizer. And then the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are actually like a recombinant adenovirus DNA. It's sort of a combination, and they work differently.
This is like a whole subject we can go. I mean, it's great because we are all being vaccinated, and sometimes we have to choose, and sometimes there's a lot of controversy into that subject. So
yeah.
I give you one more minute.
One more minute. This goes into like casualties of war. So it's pretty much that the multi-system inflammatory syndrome that kids are getting, it's the same thing as what adults are getting. It just manifests differently because kids don't have ACE in their lungs, so kids don't get lung symptoms, it gets skin symptoms worse. And I think that the whole overlying theme is that there's more similarity amongst everything than difference. The COVID-19 disease in the young and the adults and children is more similar than different. COVID-19 compared to other kinds of coronaviruses and other diseases are more similar than different. So I think a lot of it is seeing it in that way really alleviates some fear and makes some sense out of things. Yeah, and I'll
Farah, I mean, during your whole exposition, I was thinking, how is it possible that we bring people like you to share this type of, I mean, today is a no-brainer, and thanks so much for sharing this.
I'm just glad I did it at 3 a.m. this morning. I was like,
we were all nervous for the day, that's for sure.
I was like,
because this is a marathon. We keep going, and we are switching channels. We are on Zoom. We are on Slack, on Slack House. We are on Clubhouse, and it's like
it's amazing. Quite an amazing event you guys organized.
Any sort of
just one comment, other than the fact that this woman knows tons about this stuff. Going back to the future session that I joined late again earlier this morning, for I had to run some errands. It seems like when you were talking about the futures, the gray swans, there's an arms race. I think of it as a predator-prey type of model. But my main point is that I think there's going to be a race between the messenger RNA and the pandemics to come. Because in my abundance of ignorance, it would seem that I'm a math major, not a biologist.
Math.
It would seem that math. Oh my God! It would seem that mRNA is a tool that'll help us more quickly respond to pandemics in the future.
Very much so. One of the main things that made people a little bit nervous was the speed at which the vaccine was developed. And it was developed because mRNA vaccines can be made quickly and be made in bulk in huge quantities. So, and I think the other thing is mRNA vaccines are safer than DNA vaccines because they're not, although RNA is made in the nucleus, it does all its business outside the cell. So it has less of a risk of integrating into your own genetic code, because I think a lot of people are freaked out by the idea of something is DNA, RNA, it's going to be in my genetic code, and then I'm going to have mutations and all these things down the road.
mRNA, Pfizer shots, and I have Bill Gates's his whole phenomena, his entire human genome is in me now. So I'm thinking smart thoughts. And I expect to get very wealthy very soon. But isn't it true that sarcasm aside, that mRNA really, talking to someone on LinkedIn, one of my contacts at Pfizer, that this has really been in development for decades. This is not new. It's been in research labs, and they were fortunately able to, as I tell my wife, thank God we're getting Moderna and Pfizer here, because Johnson & Johnson may be safe, and if it was the only one available, I'd take it. But I'm so thrilled about the mRNA research that was done to give us the vaccines we have.
Oh yeah, the mRNA, a lot of these like experimental or emerging kinds of vaccines have been in development in small studies, even in maybe humans and animals, small studies. But they've been in the making for a long time, never to come to fruition because we've had the live attenuated, the toxoids, all these different vaccines that we use. You know, so now we had something new that had such an urgency behind it, such a push and pull behind and in front of it, that it really just expedited a process that may have otherwise taken a long time. Like
It
meaning,
was the right place, right time.
yeah.
So thanks so much. We are topping the hour and we are switching positions. We want to introduce